Vietnam, probably the most unpopular war in American history. And because this was the most unpopular war, anti-war movements started popping up around campuses in 1965 to 1968. These anti-war marches and protests were organized by the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society. And from 1965 to 1968, their base of support only got bigger. Their goal was to show that the end of the war in Vietnam was nowhere in sight. Now, the things that happened to these protesters were not far off from the things that happened to civil rights protests. Many people would get arrested and many people would get harmed. An example of people getting arrested and people getting harmed for anti-war movements: on October 21st, 1967, 100,000 protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial and around 30,000 continued to march to the Pentagon. That night, the soldiers that were protecting the building arrested hundreds of protesters for peaceful protesting. And this event only caused the anti-war movement to get larger and larger. But before I continue about the anti-war protests, let me show you who these supporters were. Most people in America did not agree with the war in Vietnam, so it wasn't unheard of for people to join the anti-war protests. And because of that, the anti-war movement was very, very large. Most of the people that supported these groups were known as hippies, which are pretty much people that reject society and are usually advocates for peace. And the things that these people did, obviously, I think everyone knows. As you can see, this right here is a car that belongs to a hippie. You can see right here that the air freshener has the word tree on it, and tree is actually slang for marijuana. Now, protests were very common. Usually people would walk around with signs. A lot of times signs would say peace, not war, make love, not war, stop war, and a lot of things to do with peace. And this symbol right here became very, very popular in the 1960s. This was pretty much the logo for hippies and was widely used on signs in anti-war movement protests. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, it began to alienate the American youth. Now, because no one really knew who assassinated John F. Kennedy, and a lot of conspiracies and untrust in the government kind of created an epidemic of paranoia. It pretty much tainted the American youth and made them untrust the government. So the American youth really searched for people who believed in that idea. Hence, hippies. And hippies were very influential. They created a new form of style and even popularized a new form of music. People like Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys were all people that became popular in the 1960s and were very important in the anti-war movement because of the messages spoken in their songs. Now back to the actual protests and what happened during the protests. So the anti-war movement kept pushing and pushing for the war to end in Vietnam. So around 1973, Nixon announced the effective end to the U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. So in conclusion, hippies were pretty dope, and not single-handedly, but definitely helped in the war in Vietnam, which was considered the most unpopular war in American history.